Yeah, hi everybody. Welcome back to our class. Today we are going to continue to talk about evolution. I hope it's a little bit more interesting than the more like theoretical lecture from last time. Yeah, we've seen this this framework on evolution. And we've talked about quite a lot about what constitutes the genotype, how the genetic code is being translated to a sequence of amino acids which produce proteins, and proteins are one of the components which are necessary to produce a phenotype. So we heard that mutations as well as recombination always lead to novel genotypes. Yeah. So today we're going to talk about more the role of how the environment interferes with the phenotype. Yeah, so we have this relation, genotype and phenotype. Today we're going to talk more about these relationships between environment, phenotype, which then feed back to the genotype by a process which we call natural selection. So we look a little bit into how biotic interactions and abiotic drivers affect populations. But before we do that, we also look into a random effect, which we call genetic drift. Yeah. So the genetic constitution of a population is not just a result of preferential selection of phenotypes which have certain advantage, but it can also result from some random effects. Yeah. So the topics for today are genetic drift, natural selection, and finally then we will talk about the modes of speciation, so the reasons or the mechanisms how we can generate biodiversity and species richness. Yeah. So I hope you all read this book chapter I have uploaded on Moodle. If not, please take a look at it. It is just I think an easy overview of what we had discussed last week. All right, so let's start with the concept of genetic drift. So what you see here is a sailing boat which lost its sails, and so it's basically just randomly drifting in the ocean. And that's essentially what genetic drift means for a population, you know. So there is some random change in the frequencies of certain alleles. This mechanism has been proposed by an American biologist, Sewell Wright, and already in the, I think, 1940s. So it's a pretty old concept. And it's purely based on chance. Yeah. So it's not that an organism which survives and reproduces has certain advantages. It's simply a random process which determines it. And such random processes can then potentially eliminate entire alleles, and others could accumulate. Yeah. So genetic drift can result in the loss of genetic variation because it's a non-adaptive process. Those who are theoretically the individuals which are good or well adapted could just go extinct due to non-random processes. And thereby initially rare alleles could become more frequent or even fixed in a population which survives. So it is very relevant for small populations because genetic drift can then have a very large effect. So for those who study conservation, it is relevant to consider genetic drift as a potential cause for future further reduction in the genetic variation of a population. Yeah. So if you care for a rare species and you have certain random events which you can't rule out, you maybe do something by relocating a population to a safer place, because what could be causes of drift are natural catastrophes. Yeah, for instance, volcanism, hurricanes, tsunamis. So those disasters essentially do not select against better suited or less adapted organisms or individuals. They can wipe out any. Yeah. So, and as a result, your population is not representing or can potentially represent very different genetic makeup than what it was prior to a catastrophe. So I like to ask you a question, and please also geologists can step in here. Do you have any ideas what other causes could cause genetic drift? What random things may occur in nature which could have such an effect? Anyone has an idea besides the ones I've listed there?
There is an answer in the chat.
Okay.
Okay.
Floods.
What is it?
Yes, the same floods.
Okay. Floods was one good call, yeah.
There are more answers in the chat.
Okay.
Fires, continental drift.
Okay, so fires is a very important thing, yeah. So this is relevant. We've everybody has heard about these catastrophic in Australia last year, where an incredible large number of individuals of many species died. So this can have an enormous effect on the genetic composition of surviving populations. Yeah. So, but there is what else? There's one continental drift. I would not consider as a mechanism for genetic drift, because it's this very slow process, and it would still allow, if you separate populations somehow, it would still allow gene flow. Yeah, we will talk about this later. Habitat fragmentation. Yeah, it's possible if one separated population is really distinct from those another cut-off population. So these are very nice answers. Yeah, it's great to see this. So we will continue a little bit more of this kind of interactive way of trying to make sure you all can follow here. So I said that genetic drift has an influence on, or large influence on, small populations, which you can all understand. And we soon will see this in this with examples from gorillas. But it can also have a large effect on larger populations if they occur over large wide ranges, and if, for instance, at the edges of a range, distance alone is a factor that counteracts genetic exchange. Yeah. So if at the edge of a range of a species, some random effects occur, and there's less exchange with individuals from the main population or from the center of the population, then this can also lead to issues. And one of the things which one must consider if populations are isolated or small is inbreeding. So that this is mating with closely related individuals. And that can lead, in the worst case, to inbreeding depression, which means that the organisms have reduced fitness. That is a lower chance to survive and a lower chance to reproduce. We will talk about fitness later today. Yeah? And inbreeding depression, we have discussed this also the last time, can lead to an increase in homozygosity, so the loss of certain alleles. Yeah. So this has been shown, and we've discussed this last time already with this paper on mountain gorilla genomes. And on the right panel, on this right figure, you see a time scale, a logarithmic time scale, and then the effective population size, which is denoted by NE. So these are individuals which can reproduce. Yeah. So, and you see that basically over the last million years, there's pretty much constant decline in the population reconstructed based on the genomes for mountain gorillas. but there's a very large drop about 10,000, 15,000 years ago. And we'll come back to this in a second. Yeah. So just imagine genetic drift is random, and it can choose, you know, a cohort of individuals with specific genotypes and phenotypes from a population which is much more diverse and result in very reduced diversity of than the genetic and phenotypic diversity of the remaining populations, as you see here. And this brings me to two special types of drift, which we will also hear, I think, repeatedly when we later talk about specific cases in the class, specific papers. And this is one aspect, is the so-called founder effect. Yeah. So this means that a few to at least one single individual from a population migrates away from its source population and founds a new population somewhere else over a large distance. Yeah? And because these founding populations are small or very small, indeed, they can be very non-representative of the original population, and they can show a very low genetic diversity. Yeah. I give you a few examples in a second. And the next aspect of genetic drift is the so-called bottleneck effect, which we've just seen here for mountain gorillas. There's a reduction in population size and thereby a reduction in genetic variation, and the individuals which survive may not represent the genetic makeup of the formerly much larger population. And again, this could be caused by a flood. This could have been caused by fires, by other phenomena. So it's a random process. Yeah? So here we see just a simple kindergarten illustration for a founder effect. You have a mixed population at the beginning, and then from those individuals can move off, disperse somewhere else, found a new population, and they can represent different genetic compositions of the original population to the extent that they could be very, show very marginal representation. The bottleneck effect is simply just, imagine it's just visualized with this model with a bottle full of marbles. It's well mixed originally, but then something happens and only a few individuals survive, which then which then can grow as a population again after the bottleneck event is over. They grow in population size, but because the genetic variation is very low, since it goes back to a few surviving individuals, genetic variation remains low despite the fact that the population grows over time. Yeah, and it will take a lot of time to have mutations and recombination to basically increase genetic variation again. So let's look into examples. The first example is perhaps an unusual one because it is a founder effect which goes back to human activity. It is related to the release of European hedgehogs in New Zealand. European hedgehogs obviously occur in Europe, and New Zealand is the only place in the world where they have established viable populations outside their native range. And this happened in the 1860s to 1890s when hedgehogs were taken from Great Britain to New Zealand with colonists who wanted them as pets or for pest control. Most of the hedgehogs which were on these ships to New Zealand died, unfortunately. And a few individuals, probably only 30 or so, actually survived, which is shown on this map here, which shows the harbors where the ships arrived. And in parentheses, you see the individuals which were brought to these specific places and the timing. So we may have only like a few handful of individuals which founded a population which rapidly began to grow, and hedgehogs became an invasive species essentially, and later on people were paid for to hunt them. But what is interesting is that a large proportion of this population today shows various dental abnormalities. So that is that the teeth either don't develop fully or they lack certain teeth. And this has been specifically shown that the second incisor, so in German this is the Schneidezahn, the second lower incisor is often missing in these hedgehogs in New Zealand. So why is that so? The reason is that the original individuals were taken from a population of Great Britain, which is an island, is isolated from the European mainland for about 10,000 years. Since before during the Ice Age, the land was connected because the sea level was lower. And since the isolation happened, there was some inbreeding in Great Britain, which resulted that this kind of phenotypic trait became established in the populations. And apparently those which were released in New Zealand then had a large proportion of this missing or faulty teeth. So this is an example where humans can have an effect on genetic. I go and show you now that a similar effect happened with Eastern gorillas. I was involved in a study we published a couple of years ago where we've compared all available skeletal material from the Eastern gorilla. So the Eastern gorilla is a species which occurs in East Africa, in the border region between Uganda and Congo. So we have a second species of gorilla, which is the lowland gorilla, which occurs here in this part. And the Eastern gorilla is, there are two subspecies recognized: the mountain gorilla occurring in Bindi and Virunga, and then the Grawa gorilla, which is occurring in this region here in Congo. The Grawa gorilla has a much larger population, about recently up to 5,000 individuals, is currently really going down, and mountain gorilla is about 1,000. So we observed certain interesting phenotypic abnormalities in a very large proportion of the skeletons which we investigated. We tried to involve all skeletal material in all the museums, major museums in the world. And we found two interesting things. On the left side, you see in the bottom a gorilla right foot. And you see the different bones making up a foot. So we have one bone in the foot, which is called the navicular. And then we have the cuneiform. This is cuneiform 2, or the second cuneiform. And these are normally two separate bones. What we found is that these bones are fused, so they haven't separated during the development of these animals. And we found this in adults, which you can see here in the big, larger bones, and also in juveniles. So this is a very unusual phenomenon. The second is related to hand bones. So we have here shown hand, left hand for a human, and zoom in into gorilla hand. And you have two bones in your wrist. You have what is called the trapezium, and then you have a metacarpal. The metacarpals are those bones, if you really squeeze your hand, the extensions of your fingers are called metacarpals now. And normally those bones, all bones which you can move against each other, have, what would you call this?
Joint?
Yeah, joints basically. And these joints can move, so they have a certain, like, it's kind of like a positive and negative morphology. But in what we found is that in many cases, the metacarpals and the trapezia don't have these articular surfaces, as they are called, these contact zones. This here, the normal anatomy shows you the location, so one fits and the other doesn't. So we've established a frequency of these rare traits in the population of the Virunga, which is representing the mountain gorillas, and in all major populations of the Grawa gorilla. And what we found is that both traits occur between 60 and 70% in the Grauer gorilla population, and at about a third in the Virunga population. We don't have data for Bindi, but this suggests that the Bindi population, or the mountain gorilla population, is less affected by this trait, and the Grauer gorilla is, even though the population is much larger, still carry this trait up to this day. I can also add to this that Western gorillas hardly have this trait. The same is for humans. So Homo sapiens also has definitely less than 1%. So what can you infer from this? This means we inferred in founder effect that you've seen the paper I showed previously. We had a bottleneck effect for the mountain gorilla population over 1 million years, particularly after the last ice age, because habitat was just fragmented and the small population we proposed survived in this region. From this population, after the ice age, when it got warmer and wetter, one group migrated off and established a new population on the other side of the rift. So the Rift Valley is this part. And you see that the populations today are separated. Then there was volcanism in this region separating the populations. So today there's no migration between these populations, no gene flow. And then the founding population here spread and invaded the habitat and colonized this large region. So this is an example where you see a phenotypic trait being very common in a population and helping to understand that there was a random effect. One group migrated off carrying a certain phenotypic character, which then was passed on to all its descendants. Yeah. So this was not a natural selection, it was purely random effect, which we call a founder effect. So in order to counteract founder effects or genetic drift, we have a process which we call gene flow. So gene flow is the exchange of genes in a population between individuals. So we have here two populations of birds separated by a river, and occasionally one individual will fly over to the other side, mate and exchange genes. So for this reason, normally we have a well-mixed genetic composition of a population. So this process of gene flow is one of the reasons why we have stable species. Otherwise, if that wouldn't occur, you can imagine that every population which is spatially somehow separated could over time evolve into a new species, which is not the case. And we have a process which is called long distance dispersal. So certain individuals are able to disperse very fast, so they travel long distances and meet again with their separated populations and can exchange genes. So this is a relevant process.
Can I ask something?
Absolutely.
I was thinking, in this case with the gorillas, do you think that it's possible that other species also have experienced similar genetic drift? Because it's, the same event, it also affects different species, right?
Yeah. So the thing is that when we look into Africa or many parts of the tropics, which we think of very wet and warm areas, they were relatively dry during glacial periods, during ice ages, because there was less water available in the atmosphere and it was simply raining less. A lot of water was stored in ice on the ice sheets. So you can imagine that animals adapted or very confined to humid habitats such as rainforests or so probably were then as a result fragmented because the habitat was not continuously available. So bottlenecks are likely a manifestation for many species which encountered such fragmented habitats during these glacial arid periods, also in the tropics, not just mountain gorillas. But the founder effect, which I explain here, I think is a specific case. It also relates to the population dynamics of gorillas, that you have an alpha male, which basically controls the mating. Yeah, you have females wandering off from one group, and sometimes then encountering new groups, and you also have young males, but essentially an alpha male, a silverback as it is called, maintains control on its females, on its harem for a while. So this is why such events can also be fixed or amplified, you know. Whereas if you have a mouse or a rodent or other animals which reproduce rapidly and do not have such mating systems with a dominant male or female, then I think these founder effects are within a continent not so common, or at least I'm not aware of cases for the specific time interval. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much.
That's a question. Okay, cool. All right. So we talked about genetic drift and gene flow, and now let's move to the next topic, natural selection. Yeah. And it's essentially the opposite of genetic drift. So this is not a random process. The only thing which is random in natural selection is recombination and the occurrence of mutations. Yeah, nobody can control this. Yeah, but then the phenotype which is produced is either favored or at disadvantage by the process which we call natural selection. So this is not a random process. Yeah. And Darwin said about this preservation of favorable individual differences and variations and the destruction of those that are injurious, I have called natural selection. And I think in the late 80s, 87, 88, Endler wrote a book about the state of the art of natural selection in the wild about 100 years after Darwin. So that might be a useful reference. Yeah. So we define natural selection as the differential survival and reproduction of individuals due to differences in the phenotype. It's a key mechanism of evolution, and it causes a population to evolve. Yeah. And Darwin chose the term because he wanted it to contrast with artificial selection, which is everything related to animal and plant breeding, where we look and intentionally try to multiply certain traits or phenotypes. Yeah. Cows which produce a lot of milk, dogs which look fancy, or roses which have beautiful flowers. Yeah. But whereas artificial selection is intentional, natural selection is not intentional. So there is no goal or no direction, you know. So in order to be able to, in order to allow natural selection to occur, we need the differences, the phenotypic differences. We've discussed these things. We've discussed these things last time. Mutations are providing the so-called raw material. Yeah, so we need some differences, and they need to be heritable. Yeah. So they need such a difference need to be inherited. So if I let my hair grow, you know, this is not something which, you know, I will not have a baby with long hair immediately, you know. So it needs to be, as a stupid example, forget it. Okay, let's go back. But in any case, what I want to say is that these traits need to be heritable. And if they are, and if they are selected for, if they provide an adaptation, then the genotype in a population can change over time. Yeah. And because those phenotypes who carry these genotypes are favored, whereas those which do not or show a disadvantage have a lower chance of surviving or reproducing. So natural selection is a key mechanism that leads to adaptation. And it can ultimately also lead to speciation. We will see some examples later. So important is that adaptation is not just a higher likelihood of surviving, but it requires also successful reproduction. So you can understand if, like here in this case of these Darwin finches, there is an individual producing a certain type or a certain type of bill, which is useful for some accessing certain food sources. This trait will not establish in the population if that bird is not reproducing successfully. It might survive, but so that brings me to the main components which Darwin used to make a case for natural selection. And these main points are overpopulation, competition, variation, survival of the fittest, and new species. And I use here the original terminology of Darwin. In his book, The Origin of Species, he mostly talked about natural selection, and actually he does not provide such a very conclusive framework for the origin of new species. So most which we learned today about speciation, even though it's part of this list, was developed later on. Still, it is based on natural selection. So let's look into these aspects which Darwin used to make a case for his idea. The first is overpopulation or rapid multiplication. Think about that most organisms, if they wouldn't be exposed to any limitations or any kind of predation, would produce a lot of offspring, many more than in fact outside in the actual world survive and will reproduce. So normally there's a high rate of death in most organisms. So there are three examples. One is this organism Paramecium, which divides 3 times in 2 days. And so in 5 years, if that wouldn't be limited by some other mechanism or constraint somehow, within 5 years, the mass of Paramecium would equal 10,000 times the size of our planet. It's obviously not happening because there are factors limiting its population expansion. If you go outside now, you go to an oak tree, you will see underneath an oak tree hundreds, thousands of acorns. Only a minute portion of those acorns actually will make it to an adult tree again. Most will be eaten by squirrels or by jays or other birds, or just not sprout or anything. Something will happen. And the last example here is cod, a fish which we like to eat in the Mensa sometimes, produces, is typical for various fish, large number, millions of eggs a year. If they would all develop, the ocean would be full with that species within a few years. So this is what Darwin means. Normally, organisms intend to produce a lot of offspring until something is limiting it. So, and because of overpopulation, because we have a large number of individuals, especially then juveniles, there's a large competition for limited resources. Think about birds in a nest. Sometimes if a young juvenile is a little bit larger than the other, sometimes they kick out the other out of the nest just to ensure that they get all the food. So So there's a struggle, what he calls for limited resources. And what are resources? Obviously, it's not just food, it's also space and it's mates. It's if you want to reproduce, you need a mate. And so there's also competition for mating. Yeah. That is, in this example, if it's mate competition, it would be competition between, within species, but competition for food and space obviously is between species, yeah. And then there's also competition with the environment, yeah, for space, for instance, or so. So this is one component. And so we have biotic competition, yeah, like predation is a very severe case. And then we have abiotic competition. So resources are limited, for instance, by seasonal cycles. In the winter, the deer has less to eat. It has to browse on these little twigs here because there's no green, fresh biomass being produced. Yeah. So if an animal is adapted to cope with seasonal changes, then it has a higher chance to survive, obviously. We know that many animals leave the winter, so we have like migrating birds who just are not adapted to these conditions and need to leave. Yeah. So that is then a strategy to cope with this. The next aspect of natural selection is in the phenotype. We've talked about variation in the last lecture, or the origin of variation. Yeah, again, mutations and recombination. So individuals vary in terms of their traits or characteristics. Yeah, that could be coloration, it could be size, shape of certain things, it could be behavior, it could be certain physiological mechanisms, so on. And this variation is passed on to the offspring. And if the offspring has inherited a trait which increases its chance to survive, then we have an adaptation. So variation is relevant for the evolution of different morphologies. For instance, as you can see in these Hawaiian honey creepers. These birds go back to a single ancestor and have developed a large diversity of beak shapes and sizes in order to access certain food. Yeah. You can imagine if one individual develops a certain beak which is novel within a population and accesses a very nutritious food source, it has a higher chance to survive and a higher chance to reproduce. So with that, we can quickly select for these certain differences in the phenotype. And with that comes the so-called survival of the fittest. So with these prosaic words, actually, I think Darwin has a good, has chosen well to describe something, that organisms which are simply better suited for a certain condition, certain environment, certain competitive relations and so on, they will survive, whereas those which are less suited will go extinct or will not survive in similar numbers, yeah, which is shown in this example. You know, if you're a hare or a rabbit in the Arctic and your fur or your coat is dark, the chance of being seen by a predator is much higher than if you're white. Yeah. So that means survival of the fittest here in this case is that a white individual is better suited to survive and will have a higher chance of reproducing, and thereby the population will shift over time quickly to a white population because all the other ones will probably be eaten. You can think about the same situation for a predator. Think about wolves. Wolves in the Arctic are mostly white. Yeah? So this is the only region on the world where white wolves are dominant. And the reason is, of course, because the animals they eat have a lower chance of recognizing them. If you're a dark wolf on a white snowfield, you will be seen and you will have a hard chance, a hard time to find food and survive. So adaptation really increases survival. And again, it needs to be passed on to the next generation to really make a difference over time in the population. So fitness is a key concept related to the relative genetic contribution of an organism to future generations, and is determined by both survival and reproduction. So if we look into aspects in the class where we discuss climatic changes or other environmental changes, we have to think about how could this have affected the survival of individuals, such as gorillas, for instance, and their reproductive success. And we may understand why certain species went extinct over time. So a gazelle that does not survive cannot contribute to future generations. Survival alone does not assure genetic contribution, so we need reproduction. And we can measure this and we can quantify fitness. There are various ways. I'm not going to give those details. The biology students know these things. But this is just to give you the concept here in terms of what Darwin thought about it. And finally, the last aspect then of natural selection is the origin of new species, which requires the divergence of populations. So we select certain traits and certain genotypes, and then new species can arise over time. This is Darwin in a nutshell. The power from his concept comes that it can explain seemingly all perfect adaptations we encounter in the natural world. All these, you see all these different birds here. Natural selection is a very strong argument to explain the diversity of bird species, of shapes, sizes, coloration, behaviors, and everything we know, which we dub biodiversity. So obviously it doesn't stop here. People have thought since Darwin about how actually does natural selection affect a population. And three major types of natural selection have been proposed, which I try to explain you here quickly with this figure. So on the y-axis, we have the number of individuals, so denoting the size of a population. On the x-axis, we have the distribution of a phenotypic trait. Let's say, for instance, color. You go from white to black, and gray is the middle. And the first type of natural selection is called directional selection. It favors one extreme of your phenotypic range. So the intermediate, so let's say white and gray color is selected against, whereas black color is selected for. So in terms of directional selection, the whole population changes its phenotype over time. This is a mechanism which can result in new species. When the intermediate phenotype is favored, and extremes are selected against, then we have stabilizing selection. This process normally just ensures that a species continues to exist and does not lead to new species. And contrasting with that is the so-called disruptive selection. So here, the extremes of a phenotype are favored, whereas the intermediate phenotype is not. So a population can divide, and because of this mechanism, we can have speciation over time if the selective regime is maintained and these populations continue to be separated, or that these extreme or these unusual phenotypes or rare phenotypes are favored. So I give you a few examples for directional selection. So directional selection favors rare alleles. Yeah, and this is, we all know this from antibiotic resistance, for instance. Yeah, when antibiotic or biotic medicine was established, it eradicated the main phenotypes and with that the main genotypes of certain bacteria and favored those, and those which survived a small portion became resistant. And now we have the trouble to deal with those guys. The same was repeatedly observed with insects, where after the application, and this is an example here of DDT, a rare allele was favored, which you see here at the time when it was started in 1965, DDT was used. Before it was then not allowed to be used anymore since of its detrimental health consequences. It was used here in this example for 3 years, and it led to the rapid spread of a rare allele within a population, which was then almost consistent of this one allele. With the cessation of DDT application, this allele became quickly went back to its original rare frequency within the population, and the other intermediate or typical genotypes. So this is, you see that directional selection can quickly change the genetic composition of a population, but in order to have an effect, a long-term effect, it needs to be in place continuously. Otherwise, recombination and the natural selection will again select the other ones. Another example here, I bring, this is now not related to human influence. This is an actual example from the real world. It relates to coloration in a species of mouse, the deer mouse, which occurs in central North America. In this case, we look at populations in Nevada. Yeah. And there's a group at Harvard University who studies these mouse for a very long time, do really cool work in terms of looking at natural population, doing experiments in enclosures, and doing all this fancy genetic work in a lab. And they found that normally these mouse are gray, dark, which is an adaptation to dark soils. So you see here, a bright phenotype and the normal dark phenotype. And they are photographed on the contrasting soil. So this one would occur on this soil color and this one on this. So what happened after the Ice Age in Nevada, an area was formed which contains a lot of sand dunes. So there's probably some glacial material which accumulated there and was blown together to form these dunes. And in these dune fields, we see a large proportion, or the dominant proportion of these mouse or mice is yellow, because they're simply not seen by birds that prey on them. Yeah. So within less than 10,000 years, directional selection in this particular region has selected a phenotype which would otherwise be not selected for, because it would be eaten first, because it would be simply seen on dark soils. So this is a nice example where we see post-glacial geomorphological or soil processes affecting rapid selection and the formation of at least new phenotypes. And if this environment would maintain stability for hundreds of thousands, perhaps million years, without new ice ages coming or climate change messing up things, perhaps over time these two phenotypes become distinct species. And then I found another example of directional selection for Darwin finches. Darwin finches are an example normally of disruptive selection. That means you think about, you have these finches and they formed various types of bills, yeah, to access certain food resources. And so all the extremes of the phenotypic intermediate type, presumably the original founder, were selected to access certain food types. On one small island, however, which is Daphne Mayo, it's a very small island, it's this size. A couple of American biologists, I think Peter Grant and Rosemary Grant, who worked there over 30 or 40 years. They wrote several books about Darwin finches and natural selection. They studied these birds. So they went to this island, they counted every year all the birds. And up to 1982 or so, there was only one species of Darwin finch, Geospesia fortis, was the only inhabitant of this island. And normally, this species shows this large beak. Yeah, and it can access then food. So this is especially so after droughts, because then smaller plants are not accessible. And so after drought in the 70s, this is here beak size on this figure and the time. This is the intermediate size of the bill. Then the beak became bigger. Then another species flew over from an adjacent island and slowly a population got established. It was very small, up to about maybe the early 2000s. Here you see the population size of the second species. Yeah. And then another drought happened. During this drought, because two species were competing for the same resource, the new species was better adapted or more effective in exploiting it. They exhausted the food, the large seeds of one plant that they were feeding on. The populations crashed. And after that population crash, the species initially there shows only the small beak size. Because with this beak, it can access smaller, different foods. It is not competing. All the others went extinct. So these guys, this couple, collect, or basically they netted all the birds, they caught all the birds, they ringed them, and they could fully control this natural experiment. And they saw over time that there's directional selection in the presence of another competitor towards a smaller beak. So Galapagos is still a very nice place to study competition and natural selection. So a few words to what we mean by stabilizing selection. So stabilizing selection is obviously something which maintains a species over time. Yeah, so we don't have, we're not favoring certain extremes. And body mass is often used to show this case. It's also shown for humans that the size of babies is within a certain range. Yeah, so we are not favoring very small babies because they would have a smaller chance of surviving. A large baby might, the mother might not be able to give birth. So here is an example for the sociable beaver, a bird which occurs in South Africa. They build large nests, and this group of researchers were studying these weavers in one tree, in one nest, over a period of 8 years. So they could also catch every single bird, measure it, ring it individually, and weigh it. And they saw by doing this over a period of 8 years that the size in juveniles and in adults is very narrow and is fixed around a mean. And so they say low body mass is selected against because a bird with lower body mass is less fat, higher risk of starvation, and it loses more energy during cold periods. So you could think about a high body mass should be an advantage. Well, they found out, and this is also in line with other research by ornithologists, that heavier birds require more energy to fly, to take off and to stay in flight. That means they have to spend more time for feeding to maintain their body weight, which presents a higher risk to be eaten by predators. And also, because they are somewhat bigger, they're a little bit less agile than smaller birds of the same species. So the chance to escape a predator is also reduced. So this is an example which shows you that there's stabilizing selection acting basically from both sides, on both sides of a range of phenotypic variation. And I give you a last example for what we call disruptive selection, where we select the extremes against an intermediate phenotype. And here's an example with these sicklebacks. So you know them in German as dreistacheliger Stichling. Yeah? So these are sicklebacks. These are little fish who have 3 spines on their back. And in certain lakes in British Columbia, the American Pacific coast, after the Ice Age again, with the retreat of ice, lakes formed, and the sicklebacks invaded these lakes from their marine ancestral habitat. And in certain lakes, they show 2 extreme phenotypes: a very large phenotype, which is shown here in the photograph on the top, oops, sorry, and a smaller. The large one eats on the bottom of the lakes in deep water. It lives in the so-called benthic part of a lake. Yeah? So it's close to the sediment, and it feeds there, preys on the so-called benthos, the organisms living on the ground of the lake in deep water. Whereas the small one feeds on plankton in the open water. So the intermediate phenotypes, which would be of the intermediate size, are not adapted to either habitat. They are not effective in feeding and thereby acquiring their necessary energy. So they are prone to high mortalities, essentially. And so this is an example where we see a disruptive selection in a single species. Yeah. So natural selection has also produced some astonishing examples, which some people probably have a hard time to believe that they can even possibly exist. And these examples we call mimicry. So the evolution of phenotypic similarity between completely unrelated organisms. So we have here on one side anti-predator strategies. So there are certain snakes which are completely harmless, which were selected for because they look essentially very similar to a venomous snake. So then these snakes are less likely to be eaten by predators. Then we have these moths which show these big eyes, mimicking the eyes of birds. So if they open their wings, they are unlikely to be eaten because they will chase away predators. And then we have types of camouflage, which you see here in this leaf insect, which basically mimic a leaf. So natural selection favored obviously the one phenotypes which look most similar to a leaf because they were so well camouflaged that they were simply not eaten. And so the population at some point was looking mostly like a leaf, whereas those which looked most dissimilar to a leaf were eaten. There are also these cases where a flower, where flowers like these are orchids of the genus Ophrys, they developed flowers which mimic bumblebees because with this type of flower, there's definitely a higher chance to attract the bumblebee and be pollinated. So if you not look like a bumblebee, your chances being less likely. And so these flowers make a larger contribution to the genotype of the population, and quickly you can have these incredible adaptations. Yeah. And this brings me to the last point of natural selection, which we call co-evolution. Yeah. So that two organisms evolve in response to each other. Yeah, like as we have seen these bumblebees and these orchids. Yeah. They can become so tightly that in the end, in certain, we see this in particular in certain plant-pollinator relationships, that there's only a single pollinator available to pollinate one single plant. So, and obviously the plant then provides resources, nectar, sugar to this pollinator, which does not need to compete with other birds or moths, for example, for this nectar and this energy source, yeah, because it's the only species to access these resources. So these are relationships which we call mutualism. We have also what we call plant herbivore relationships, where plants are being eaten by certain animals, yeah, and as a result, they develop certain adaptations such as spines, everything which is helping them to avoid being eaten, because every lost leaf means they have to invest more energy to make a new one, or bark or so. And plant herbivore relationships are one of the possible cases which explain the high diversities of trees in the tropics, where in certain areas where we have the same soil conditions, same climate conditions, we have a large number of tree species on the same homogeneous environment. And the reason is that certain plants escape herbivory by developing certain chemical compounds. We all know cocaine or coffeine. These are plant compounds which evolved in response or as defense mechanisms in response to herbivory. But there are always certain herbivores which are then evolving resistance against these things and which are able to feed on those plants. So they are these so-called arm races. And a race indeed is also happening here on this photograph between cheetahs, the fastest land mammals, and Thompson gazelles. So if you have a chance to go to East Africa, you can perhaps experience this. And this is also a so-called, or an example for potential evolutionary arm race, since here selection acts on the speed of the animal. Yeah. The faster the predator is, the higher chance it has to feed, whereas the faster the prey is, the gazelle is, the higher the chances to escape, survive, and reproduce. Yeah. So with that, I went through within like, I don't know, half an hour through the whole thing, which took Darwin 30 years or so and keeps biologists busy for forever. What we mean by natural selection. Do you have any questions or any ideas or anything you want to say about what you think is relevant for natural selection, or you have some other comments where you think, oh, there's new insight into natural selection, what I just said is maybe out of date, then please raise your voice now. I like to hear what you guys are thinking, and I want to know if everything is clear. And if not, I can try to explain things, or you can explain among each other. So if this is not the case and you could follow this, then in the last couple of minutes we have here available, we'll talk about speciation. Also here, there's a book which I can recommend, Coin and Ore, simply called Speciation. So when we talked about biodiversity, we came across the issue that there are various species concepts. And in this class, we will not solve this issue, and it will probably never be solved because certain preferences exist. However, let's go back to the biological species concept, which was established by Ernst Mayr. So we call a species a group which is reproductively isolated and in which all individuals can potentially actually interbreed with themselves and are genetically isolated to other such groups. So what the strength of this concept is that it gives, in comparison to the previous morphological concepts which just looked at certain characters, an evolutionary perspective here. It looks at reproductive isolation. And so this reproductive isolation can occur under geographic, behavioral, or physiological conditions. And we need selection, mutation, and genetic drift to accumulate genotypic and phenotypic differences between populations. And over time, then we can have speciation if we don't maintain gene flow. So speciation is sometimes also called cladogenesis or cladogenesis, the genesis of new clades. This is a term which comes from taxonomy. So a clade is a group of organisms that originate from a common ancestor. We call this also a monophyletic group. Simply saying it goes back to a common ancestor. And here we have a so-called cladogram or phylogenetic tree. So, and a monophyletic group would be the blue one. It could also be this one or this one. So it goes back to one common ancestor. And if this is not the case, we have a paraphyletic group. So we cut here these branches, and then we would need, if this is monophyletic, we would need to include this entire group over there. So I only mention this because we will use phylogenetic trees later in the class many times. But what I want to say is that today in taxonomy, because of the rise of genetic data and that these relationships, these phylogenetic relationships are often based on genetics. Monophily is a guiding principle to modern systematics. So if you want to describe a new species, you want to present genetic data that shows that it's a monophyletic clade. The point is always, which is contested, is where you make the cutoff and say this is a species or subspecies. We're not going to discuss these issues. But what has been shown is that various species which were described under the morphologic species concept were actually paraphyletic. So this leads to revisions on how many species are there. Okay, so thinking again about the biological species concept, we have reproductively isolated populations. So speciation requires the evolution of reproductive isolating barriers. That means that at some point, two populations cannot mate with each other. This is so fundamental. We need reproductive isolation. And reproductive isolation is not necessarily something which is favored by natural selection, but is a byproduct of natural selection. Think about directional or disruptive selection. Certain phenotypes come into existence, and are favored by certain environmental conditions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that their reproductive isolation is being selected. This happens with time, as long as the populations are divided and do not maintain gene flow. And this reproductive isolation can happen either before there is mating, so before two individuals come together and mate, and there's a fertilization of the egg, then we call it pre-mating or prezygotic isolation, or it happens after mating and after exchange of genes. And there are different ways how you can maintain this pre-mating or prezygotic isolation, which all disrupt or reduce gene flow. Yeah. So that could be ecological or habitat. Yeah. Two populations start to invade, as we've seen in this mice. We have a mice on brighter soils, one on a mouse on brighter soils, one on dark soils. So there's a low chance that they will have gene flow. There could be seasonal temporal changes. That is, for instance, if a bird starts to sing a week earlier, so the female which is around will select the one, but if the male bird is too late to call the females, it has no chance. So seasonality or temporal changes can also lead to these things. Behavior is the same. Yeah? So if a bird, for instance, starts to have its mating plumage at a different time, or its mating behavior is different, that a female doesn't recognize it, the song is different, for instance, yeah, then there could be behavioral isolation. Then there's mechanical isolation, the so-called key and lock thing, that the genitals just don't fit. Yeah. Pollinator isolation is when certain plant phenotypes diverge so much that only specific pollinators can fertilize them or pollinate them, sorry. Yeah. And then we have a lot of things which can happen regarding if fertilization has occurred, then if we have two diverging populations, we form these hybrids, but then they can either die immediately, they're inviable because of poor health, or they're sterile, which happens, for instance, I think that if you cross horses and donkeys and have a mule, I think mules are sterile, but please correct me if I'm wrong. I know that in one direction, I think it works. In any case, if we have established reproductive isolation, then we can have a species. We can have the origin of two species from one ancestor. We have 4 modes of speciation: allopatric, peripatric, parapatric, and sympatric. So these are the main geographic modes of speciation. And when we discuss biodiversity later in certain case studies, we have to consider those mechanisms. Which one could have resulted in the specific examples we are going to discuss? So try to remember some of them. It's not a large number. So allopatric speciation is considered the most important mode. It is the mode of speciation mostly invoked for mammals and for birds. And it has been strongly advocated by Ernst Mayr. So he had a very strong opinion on the other modes, and he said this is probably the most important one. It simply says at the beginning, as you see on this figure here, you have one population, an interbreeding population. And then you separate this population by some environmental or some either physical or other kind of barrier, which we call a reproductive barrier. So these populations are split and gene flow ceases. So they are isolated from each other and evolve independently. The barrier at some point can disappear, and the two populations can come together again, which we call then secondary contact. And they can even occur sympatrically. That means after they have diverged, they can occur in the same area. The process of splitting a population by some kind of physical barrier is called vicariance. This is a term which you should remember, because we also come back to vicariance repeatedly when we talk about things like plate tectonics, river incision, mountain building, and so on. So here we have an example. We have a population of these snails occurring in one region. Then we have a mountain forming, separating these Snails, they can't interbreed. Let's say the mountain is too cold. It's not the habitat for them to cross the mountain. And they separate to the extent that they become reproductively isolated. That takes presumably a lot of time. When the physical barrier is removed or disappears for some reason, they come together and they have become distinct species if reproductive isolation is completed. So they are not interbreeding anymore. They are not producing hybrids. So this is allopatric speciation. As an example, which we are going to discuss, is the formation of the Isthmus of Panama, the land bridge between North and South America, which gives us a good example how we can test the existence of allopatric speciation. How can we do that? How can we test it? So what we need is we need to identify two sister species. Sister species are those which go back to a common ancestor. So they separated, So think about these two fishes being part of once an interbreeding connected population, and this isthmus split them. So we need sister species with non-overlapping geographic ranges. Then we do molecular phylogenetics to date, which we talk about, I think, in the next lecture, how we do this, to date the age of the split of these two sister species. We can use the molecular clock for doing this, the topic of the next lecture. And if the age then is the age of the emergence of the barrier, which we can determine by geological methods such as radiometric dating, then we can prove indeed that allopatric speciation occurred. Let's I give you here some example for this case with the Isthmus of Panama. So there's a debate when that happens, but people said it happened 3 million years ago, that the land bridge formed. That disrupted gene flow between the marine, Pacific, and Caribbean species. And then people looked at it and used DNA sequence data for sister taxa, for echinoids, crustaceans, fish, and mollusks. And they showed that about 30% of the species occurring on either side, on the sister species on either side of the isthmus, split at the time when the isthmus had formed. 60% split earlier, and 8 remained magically in genetic contact. So that shows you that it's not consistent. And so in this class, we will look at these questions in detail by looking at geological dating and these phylogenetic trees. So another example here is the split between bonobos and chimpanzees. So these are distinct species. They split about, according to genetic and genomic data, about 1.3 million years ago. So relatively recently in geologic time. And they are separated by the Congo River, which is a large river. Chimps and bonobos are not good swimmers, and I think they mostly avoid deep water. And the Congo is a huge river, so it's a very effective barrier to dispersal. And the formation of the Congo River is estimated 1.5 to 2 million years ago. I'm not so sure how well established this age is. This is what the literature is saying. But if this is true, genetic data cannot rule out the hypothesis that the formation of these two species is related to vicariance by the formation of a river, splitting two originally combined populations. And this is called the river barrier hypothesis in general, which goes back to Alfred Russel Wallace, who worked in the Amazon in his early age. So it's a very old hypothesis. So one form of the allopatric speciation, which also goes back to Ernst Mayr, is peripatric speciation. So it's the case where a small population or subset of a population leaves the range of occurrence and establishes a new population somewhere else outside the main range, a peripheral population. Yeah. And because of the distance between these two populations, there's reduced or no gene flow. Yeah. And this is a typical mechanism to explain speciation on islands. So Ernst Mayr came to this idea when he studied kingfishers, so these birds in New Guinea and surrounding islands, and he found that these kingfishers, that all these small islands have endemic species, looking kind of similar to a common ancestor which lives on the mainland, but the environment there on these small islands is very similar to New Guinea. So natural selection does not explain these slight differences in that there are different species existing. So he came up with this idea of the founder effect, which we've discussed earlier. So a small group with a specific genetic makeup colonizes a remote area, establish a population, and becomes, because of the lack of a gene flow, a distinct species over time. Yeah. This is what we call peripatric speciation, and it mostly is relevant in island settings. Yeah. For instance, the colonization of Galapagos goes back to one common ancestor of Darwin's finches, which obviously came from the South American mainland. So we can have here a case of peripatric speciation. But then obviously there was a lot of selection to different things on these islands. So we have a radiation, which we discuss later in the class. So there are two more types which are not so common, rather unusual. We have the parapatric speciation, which occurs between subpopulations which still have some kind of overlap, yeah? Where they can actually hybridize. Yeah? But this type of speciation is favored by what we have discussed earlier, disruptive selection. So think about here, we have an area with dark soil and white soil again. And so we favor two phenotypes of a mouse, for instance, as we had seen. And in the middle where these soils meet, there might be some hybridization occasionally, but in the long term, these phenotypes will separate because of non-random mating. The dark mouse would select rather a mate which is also dark instead of a white one. Yeah. So this is what we call assortative mating. I give you another example in a second. So we have unequal gene flow because of this non-random mating. Yeah. And parapatric speciation can be observed along environmental gradients. Yeah, we just gave the example soil, soil colors, but it could also be, let's say, density of vegetation, climate, whatever. Yeah. So we will think about those aspects later in the class where we think about environmental gradients. Yeah. So here's an example for parapatric speciation. We have two of these birds, these orioles. So they occur in North America, the Baltimore oriole in the east and Bullock's oriole in the west. And in the central part of their, they still form a hybrid zone. That's where the ranges meet. So these hybrid zones are typical evidence for parapatric speciation because it shows that speciation is not completed, yeah, and that there is contact. However, there's no selection for the hybrids. Yeah. Instead, natural selection will reinforce reproductive isolation of the two forms, a mechanism which is termed reinforcement. So the two phenotypes, for instance, are maintained and the intermediate form is selected against. Yeah. So parapatric speciation requires that there's selection against hybrids. Yeah. If that wouldn't be the case, we would never split these populations to distinct species. Yeah. And it requires that the two different forms which evolve in this population, or these two subpopulations, mate only with the members of their own. So we need reproductive isolation. An example where this is not yet completed is the crows, which actually have a hybrid zone right here in East Germany. So we have two, what is that? Sometimes they are considered species, sometimes subspecies. Now we have a dark one and a gray one. And there's the hybridization zone in Central Europe, but hybrids are not favored because either the dark bird or the gray bird, they preferably mate with the phenotypes which look most similar to themselves. If a hybrid has been produced, it essentially looks ugly to them. Hybrids are not selected as potential mates. So this is what we call reinforcement. So these two populations reinforce themselves by just preferential mating. So the color here is the signal for a bird to choose the mate.
Is it always the case? I mean, if you look at dogs, for example.
I mean, dogs is not a good example because it's a.
I mean, is it, you say if there is a.
This is
if there is selective mating, then the species.
Selecting has been shown, and I give the last example of this sympatric speciation is showing this too, has been shown as a very important factor. So which we have here is basically not natural selection, but sexual selection. And let's try, I tried to answer this question about Guillaume with the last mode of speciation, which we call sympatric speciation. So sympatry means that organisms occur in the same area. And so sympatric speciation is simply the origin of two species in the same geographic region without barriers to gene flow. I mean, no physical or others. So this requires, again, what we have called earlier disruptive selection. We need to have reproductive isolation over time. So how do we do this? How do we disrupt gene flow if species occur in the same place? So, and this is often, sympatric speciation was often considered as not relevant, but in certain cases, in particular these lakes in the tropics, it has been shown to be extremely relevant because there are these very species-rich lakes, for instance, in East Africa, Lake Victoria, Lake Malawi, Lake Tanganyika, which have a group of species which we call cichlids, in German Buntbarsche. And they all go back to one common ancestor that colonized these lakes at some point. And today you have hundreds of species. And you can only explain this by non-random mating. And often it is that females choose mate their males by similar coloration. So we call this assortative mating. So here it is really sexual selection which maintains reproductive isolation. So the example is, think about a fish that feeds in a benthic, so in the bottom of the lake, and one which feeds in the pelagic, so in the open water. If a female starts preferentially mate with a male in the benthic, they mate select for males that are preferred there, and mating not with the individuals in the pelagic zone. So then mating becomes non-random. So here's my last slide for today. The example of sympatric speciation by the cichlids. And we talk about this when we talk about East Africa. You have the chance to read a paper on the so-called adaptive radiation of the genus Haplochromis. which is a group of cichlids that evolved in Lake Victoria over the past 15,000 years only. So this is the most rapid example of speciation for vertebrates, which we know to date. Over 500 endemic species evolved in a very short period of time in the absence of physical barriers in one lake. Yeah. So, and it goes back to sexual selection or preferential or mating. Yeah. Okay, I see that there are a lot of,
Just one question. Are there any news about the presentations?
Nope. No news about the presentations yet.
Okay, thank you.
No, well, no. I mean, next time is there is still.
We still have 3 lectures, I think. 2 on biogeography, 1 on geodynamics. And then we start with the first active work. Which is so you will use some software to do plate tectonics,
Yeah.
I think.
So
And then we will read some papers related to that, I think. Huh?
Yeah. Maybe they want to do some presentations already. But yeah.
Yeah. Are there any other questions related to the topic of today? We posted I think the lectures on Moodle already, so you can check the slides. If you have a chance to visit a library or get a hold of these books I put on here, you can read about these aspects. Otherwise, maybe Google for these papers. I can also, if you're interested, I can also post some of these papers, which I used today as examples for these different types of natural selection as well as the speciation.
Any questions on the lecture? Nobody has any questions?
I don't have a question, but it's just like a remark. So
Go
maybe
ahead.
my colleagues can also help me with this. When we learn about the selection and the modes of selection, we learn about 5 types. And,
Okay.
and we mentioned today 3 of them, but also there is one that is called truncation selection
Okay.
and balancing selection.
Ah, yeah.
Can you explain?
Well, what I remember is that truncation selection, it was when allows only those species with the highest traits to reproduce.
The highest traits, what do you mean by the highest traits?
So the one that is like
The
for
most
example,
marked, the strongest trait?
like I think yes, like the strongest trait. So it's, for example, if humans can decide which traits are favorable.
Okay, so it's a little bit like the sympatric speciation? Or?
What I was a little confused when I learned this, but I thought it was similar to the artificial selection.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. That's why maybe someone can also jump in, or the balancing selection. It was the selection that maintains polymorphism.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, but
So it's probably stabilizing selection, which I mentioned, is
yeah. I mean, it's a separate
phenotype, and balancing might be then the whole range.
Yeah, it's when the overdominance, when heterozygotes is fittest.
Okay.
Like, for example, I think I remember that it was like the immune systems and the virus, that the more diverse you are, the more antibodies you can produce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you keep, so this would be the balancing selection.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
To keep a large variety. Yeah, I think you covered that somehow in the beginning.
But we learned something like that in the
Well, to me, I mean, as a really, I don't know, as a geologist, it seems to me that this is not very well defined. Actually, everybody has his own theory.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the books you're using, obviously.
Exactly.
But yeah,
I use
but I think that the main
textbooks
ones are
when I compile the lectures to try to be consistent. And I come back to find that I found that these three versions are often used, but I also, for instance, the paper I showed about the two mice, yeah, the yellow and the dark mouse, they call it divergent selection. Yeah, which, I mean, is that then directional or is it disruptive? But I can see that one phenotype diverges from the other. Yeah? So I think then the question is there an intermediate type between those two? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. But yeah, no, beside that, everything is good. It was just like how I remember we more or less learn it. So
yeah, I think Jose, and that I would say this to everyone, there is some terminology, and I'm not, you know, I don't require that anyone needs to learn these things. The main thing I'm saying, or I'm trying to explain these things, is just to make you guys aware about certain concepts and certain thinking and certain mechanisms which are around. Yeah, I mean, obviously these are idealized models, and we can measure these things sometimes, but often it is very difficult to find good examples, you know, because this is what theory may predict, but nature is so complex, and measuring phenotypes and really observing these changes in a population is extremely difficult unless you manipulate somehow the environment, because evolution takes so much time. You know, what do we see if you look into outside in the field and observe things, right? So it's more like these types, I think, help you to understand what can happen with natural selection to certain organisms. Yeah. So, and I think, for instance, directional selection is a good example when we think about global warming. Yeah. So we see here that in spring, certain flowers start to, certain plants start to flower earlier. But at some point, so there's a direction, you know, selection perhaps in the timing of flowering, because then the drought in the summer will be earlier, you know. But at some point, it could also lead to extinction because the genotype doesn't give you a timing to flower in January, you know, if seasonality completely fails. Yeah. So I think there are situations when we talk about climate, how we can think about how these selective models can apply or could apply. But obviously that there could be various ways how these things play out in the real world.
yeah, definitely. That's how. Yeah, and like you said, like sometimes some other things are like not very well defined, or and yeah, there's several ways to do it.
And it's the same with speciation. There's the whole ideas of speciation. They you know, they had all their times when certain modes of speciation were favored. Right now, you will not read much about allopatric speciation, but mostly about sympatric speciation. It's such a specific case, but because it's so unusual, it is a very interesting and provoking case, which you know, causes researchers to invest a lot of you know, into figuring out what's going on. So there's every other month you will find a paper on sympatric speciation in the big journals. But it doesn't mean that it's like the most common thing. What we have to think about in the class is, if we look at biodiversity, if we look at the species composition in certain areas, specifically biodiversity hotspots, the question is which mode can really explain the diversity. And if we need allopatric speciation, we need the occurrence of barriers. Do we see, you know, we have millions of species on the planet. Do we have so many barriers right there, or were there so many barriers in the past when the modern species have evolved? So does, for instance, geology provide us a framework to understand biodiversity just by looking at the allopatric model? Or do we have to go and say, no, it's probably there's more evolution in sympatry, or other factors instead of physical barriers are relevant? Yeah. So, I mean, think about the Andes as a mountain range. If the allopatric model would be the only model, you would think, okay, there should be an equal number of species pretty much on either side of the Andes, which all originate from splitting ancestral population. But this is obviously way too simple and not in accordance with the diversity maps show us. And the distribution of animals and plants is different.
Mhm.
The lecture is over.
Okay.
I already left the answer.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's many fascinating topics all over.
Yeah, no, it's good.
It's good that at least somebody is appreciating class content. Cool.
Well, I'm sure everybody's
Yeah.
loving it. Do we have to read something for next time?
No, I will give you something to read on Wednesday for the weekend, but not for today. Okay, thanks everybody for calling in and listening. Hope you learned something, and we see us on Wednesday. Okay, bye-bye.